Matthew here from MiniWarGaming.com, and I'm excited to finally be able to make a video on reviewing this, the new Apocalypse Rulebook.
We work so you can play.
I've been waiting for this for quite a while for a couple reasons. One, next week, as of the time of me making this video, is our 4th annual Apocalypticon, and that is where we do a massive apocalypse game, as big as we can make it. This year we're on track to do about 600,000 points, all fully painted and based, so it should look spectacular. Last year we did 500,000 points, but it wasn't required that it was painted. So I was eager to get this. We're not going to be using these rules this year because it's only a week and a half away and it's too soon to make all of these changes. But I was excited because I wanted to see what they would do with the new edition. Funny thing is, I thought that all this Apocalypse Rulebook was going to be was simply a little bit of an update and an alignment to the 6th edition rules, but it turns out that it's much more than that. So in the following series of videos, I'm going to be reviewing the contents of the Apocalypse Rulebook and talking about what's new, what's changed, what hasn't changed, and also what I think, because there's some things that I really like, and there's some things that I'm not as big a fan of. And of course, as you can see, I'm flanked by a couple of the new Apocalypse super heavy vehicles. We've got the Khorne Lord of Skulls right here, which will be getting put together and Dave will be having fun with. And then we've got the Necron Tesseract Vault, but it can also be made into the Obelisk, I believe is what it's called. So it has 2 different formations that you can make this with a huge Catan shard inside of it. And also you can have the shard on its own. And I have 2 of these. There's the other one, and these will get put together pretty soon as well, one in each of the different types of vehicles. So you can look forward to seeing those in future battle reports. Probably not for a few weeks because we got to get them all together and then we got to make an Apocalypse battle report, but pretty soon. So what are we going to cover in the next few videos? Well, first off, we're going to talk about the new rules, because believe it or not, this Apocalypse Rulebook actually updates and changes the way Apocalypse is played. There's a lot of things that are still the same, but they have made some modifications so it becomes its own entity. I have to say that the thing I was most disappointed with the original Apocalypse Rulebook was that it was basically just a, here's the new rules, play with whatever you want, and here's some new data sheets and some assets. That was really it. There wasn't much of a difference in the game except that it gave you an excuse to play mega games. Now don't get me wrong, that's fun, but I was really looking forward to seeing it actually alter the way the game is played. Well, this book does that. We're also going to talk about the new mission types, which allow you to play Apocalypse in more than one way. And there's new formation types. This is the thing that I'm most excited about, but we'll get to that later. We also have new destroyer weapon rules, which a lot of people are up in arms about, and I'll talk about my feelings of that, the things I like about it and the things I don't like. And of course we have the new templates, so they actually decided to update the template set for the Apocalypse rules as well, although I have to disagree on their decision to make them limited quantities on their store. I hope that that's just a temporary thing, because when I went to order them, I saw that they said while quantities last. And it seems kind of foolish to have something as essential as templates be a limited item. So maybe they're going to re-release them later on, I'm not sure. And then lastly, we can talk about the Armageddon campaign that's included near the end of the book, which gives you a full-fledged campaign of the battle at Armageddon with the orcs. And so it has all sorts of special rules just for that. And it's a really good example of what you can do with a group of friends with a lot of models. So let's get right into it. The first thing we're going to talk about, of course, are the new rules. Now, like I said before, I was disappointed when originally the Apocalypse game came out, and this is years ago, because it didn't really change that much of how the game is played. I was looking forward to something that would streamline the game to life for bigger games and also change up how it feels. And while they did add things like strategic assets and formations and super heavies and all of that, that was neat, but it just didn't seem like enough. Well, this book actually feels like it adds enough new rules that it changes a bit of the way the game is played. Now, some of the things are still the same. For example, when choosing your army, you're able to bring whatever you want. And in this case, you can bring whatever you want from whatever army. You can mix and match. You don't even have to have any reason to. You could bring in an Imperial Guard army and then stick an Eldar character into it, and then bring a Tyranid Biotitan into it, and then whatever you want. There is no restriction as to what you bring. In fact, they even encourage you to not even count your points. It's just for you to bring all your models and for your friends to bring all their models onto the table. Now you might think, well, how are you supposed to balance the game? And first off, the answer to that is Warhammer 40k usually isn't balanced, even when you bring the same number of points. But the second thing is, you'll notice if you've ever played an Apocalypse game, you know that when you go up to a large scale, balance is kind of thrown out the window, because in one shooting phase you can lose a lot of points worth of models. And is that balanced? Well, in the end, you have a lot of fun destroying things and watching your things get destroyed. And so that kind of helps eke out the balance. But in this one, they actually say, they really encourage you, just bring whatever you have. And then you try to even it up. Like if you have 4 people playing, you look at the armies, and if there's 2 guys with big armies and 2 guys with small armies, obviously you want a big and a small against a big and a small. But they have ways of changing it up as well. When you take the organizer, for example, he can look at it and say, well, this one side definitely has the advantage, so we can give a few more strategic assets to the other side. Either way, that really hasn't changed much since before, except that there is absolutely no restriction at all to what you bring. Whereas this year in Apocalypticon, for example, the restriction is that you can only bring things that could be allied. Well, next year with these new rules, there probably won't be any restrictions whatsoever. Just bring everything you own, and that way we can have the most massive, large game ever. Now, of course, if you're playing with your friends, you might want to have something that looks more thematic than just a bunch of random models, in which case you might restrict. You can only have one army, or as Imperium, for example, Space Marines and Imperial Guard can mix, but most of the Xenos side cannot. And that's perfectly fine too. You really can do whatever you want with it. You can throw in all the house rules you like. So that hasn't changed much. The battlefield hasn't changed much. You still set it up with, they give you the ideas for how big the table should be. They say no thicker or no wider than 8 feet, because you can't really reach into the middle, and I can agree with that. In fact, I would say no wider than 6 feet, because we've played a flyer battle the other day, and we've set up the table 6 feet long, like this. So this is a 6 foot and 4 feet by 6 feet, and we set them up like this. And it was still pretty hard to reach across into the middle and move it, because that's 3 feet plus picking up your models. But they say up to 8 feet, and then usually not any longer than 24 feet long. And of course, that's for really massive battles. But they give you the general ideas for the table, but once again, it's flexible for you to do whatever you want. And generally with your terrain, as opposed to 40k where you kind of spread out your terrain, in Apocalypse, you like to group your terrain together in areas and leave nice wide open spaces. And that is so you can fit all your models, so it doesn't take you forever to move your guys through difficult terrain. And so there's a big killing field where the big weapons can drop their templates and see lots of guys die. Generally, you don't want things to survive really well in Apocalypse, otherwise the game takes way too long. Now, what's really changed is they've introduced a new game length mechanism and a turn mechanism. And what this is basically, instead of things happening at the end of every turn, what they say is that you're supposed to set your schedule for the game. So let's say you're going to play a game all day long from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. They say to actually schedule breaks. Now, these scheduled breaks are important because they actually factor into the gameplay. For one thing, in some formations and data sheets, it says after a scheduled break, you can do this. After a scheduled break, you can do that. And I think that's an interesting way to look at it, because a scheduled break could be right in the middle of a turn. And so it can really change up how the game is played. They talk about taking informal breaks. You can take a break whenever you want, but only the scheduled ones are the ones that actually affect the game. So the number of turns that you play is just based on the time limit. So you set a time limit, and when you reach that time limit, you finish the current game round that you are on, and then the game is over. And so it could be 4 turns, it could be 7 turns, it could even be longer than 7 turns, although it's very unlikely that you'll get that high. When we do Apocalypticon, we typically tried our best to do 5 turns, and we've been successful with that, because we feel that getting 5 turns in gets enough stuff done that you feel like the game has progressed far enough. It would really be nice if we can get 6 turns in, because that would probably clean up a lot of the things and make it really feel like one side is won. But 5 turns definitely seems to be the minimum. So if you're playing, you should shoot for that. And so it's kind of neat how they set that with this new mechanic for scheduled breaks. And it really does play to how you play Apocalypse, because you do need those scheduled breaks. Unlike a regular battle that you can just kind of play through and right up to the end, you don't even have to take a break because it only takes you 2 or 3 hours. And of course, first turn and victory conditions, those are different for each mission. The very first mission, of course, is just like the other ones where you bid for how much time you'll have for deployment, and the side that bids the lowest, of course, gets first turn. But now they have other mission types where it's not even up to you necessarily whose turn it is, because there's going to be a dice roll to find out. And there's stealing. They've actually introduced stealing the initiative into the game. Now, I personally hate the mechanic steal the initiative in regular Warhammer 40k, because I feel that by rolling off to see who goes first, and the person who goes first deploys first, I find that helps to balance slightly the first person's turn, the advantage that they have by going first, basically. Because when they go first, they get to shoot first, they get to inflict casualties, but because they deployed first, you got to see where they deployed, and you get to then put your guys out. But then all of a sudden there's this 1 in 6 chance. It seems to happen more often than 1 in 6 times that the person who deployed second gets to go first, so they have the advantage not only in deployment, but in shooting. Of course, if you just want to look at it as a random game, that's perfectly fine. But I like to look at it a little bit more tactically than that, and that really throws me off. And I really don't like to seize the initiative. So I don't like that they introduced it into the Apocalypse game, because when you scale it up to an Apocalypse-sized game, it matters even more who goes first, because the first player is going to be dropping down those templates. Now, you do have things like your reserves, your strategic reserves and flyers and stuff coming in, and they did change actually how the reserves works and what comes in at one point. And so that kind of helps too, because if you're getting shot at first and you have all this stuff in reserve, well, at least that stuff is safe, and then your flyers and stuff can come on and start doing damage as well. So that, I guess in that sense, it's kind of put the balance back into it. Although I do have to say, before I go any further, if you're playing Apocalypse and hoping for it to be balanced, you're going to be very disappointed. You need to play it with pure fun in mind. You cannot go into it with any sort of tournament mindset, because you will be, well, I wouldn't want to play against you if that's the way you looked at it, and your friends won't want to either. You should enjoy blowing things up and watching your guys get blown up. We have one member of our club who plays Tyranids, and his name is Gary, and his favorite thing was to put out hundreds of gaunts so he can see the big 10-inch templates drop down on top of them, and to remove all the gaunts from that 10-inch template and see that big hole there. He just enjoys that. He enjoys watching his guys get blown to smithereens, because that's what's supposed to happen to your armies in a game of an apocalypse. And then he gets to march up the rest of his guys and do some damage of his own. And so that is where the fun of Apocalypse comes in, bringing all your guys and watching them die and watching them dish out a lot of damage as well. So you really need to have good sportsmanship to really enjoy a game of Apocalypse. And they've introduced new mission special rules. For example, not just mission special rules, but also what happens at the beginning of each turn. For example, they have these divine intervention things, where basically your army, because you have to choose one warlord for your army, whatever race he belongs to or whatever codex he's from, there's certain conditions that have to be met, and if those things are met, then he's able to do a divine intervention. For example, with the Imperial Guard, if they've lost at least half their guys, they get to call in their god, and they get a divine intervention where for one turn they get Furious Charge and one other rule that I can't remember what it is. But essentially they get this big boost for one turn. And every race basically has its own special divine intervention, although a lot of them are similar to that, when there's like a certain number of casualties, or you've inflicted a certain number of casualties, or you're close to an objective, whatever happens to be. These things get set off, and every race has one, even though it's called divine intervention. Even things like the Tyranids and the Tau have them as well, because they just have their own equivalent. And then we also have what's called the finest hour, where your warlord gets to do extra stuff as well. And then they even have a war master, where if you have multiple players on one side, one of the warlords is declared as the war master, and he gets to do even more stuff as well. So I'm not going to tell you everything that happens. You can buy the Apocalypse Rulebook from Games Workshop or from your local gaming store, or online from an online store. So you can see all the stuff for yourself. But I'll say right now, it's definitely worth getting. Lastly, with the new rules comes the new missions. And this is a nice thing, because instead of just having the one Apocalypse mission that used to be, where you drew a diagonal line across the board, and one side had one side, or one player had one side and the other player had the other side, and then you just fight, and there's 6 objectives on the board, and you go for those by the end of the game. Now they introduce even more game types and new missions. And this allows you to kind of see the different potential things that you can do with your own games of Apocalypse. Now, Apocalypse really lends itself to home-brewed rules rules and campaigns and missions, but it's nice that they give you more. I find that the more that a manufacturer, that the game designers can give you, the more you're able to then extrapolate and make your own stuff. So if they just give you one mission and then say, go nuts, like they did with the campaign tiles, if you remember that, the Planetary Empires, where you have those campaign tiles, they give you like one sample campaign and then they say, now use your imagination, use these however you like. They didn't really sell those very well, and they didn't do very well because you can't ask the players to create everything. You need to give them a lot. The more you can give them, the more they can then create on top of that. So I'm glad that they included, I think it's 6 different missions that you are able to play with your friends, and then of course you can take those, modify them to make your own new missions, or you can create your own new ones just based off of what you've seen, or just whatever you want to do. And so these range from just simple deployments to Stealing Initiative, all the way up to Exterminatus, where it's an entire planet that's at war and it's just doing all sorts of massive cool things. So once again, I'll leave you to read the rulebook to see exactly what those are, but it is really neat that they've added those new mission types. So that is all about the new rules and the new mission types. And so next we are going to discuss the new formation types, and this is the thing that really has me excited, so stay tuned for that.